And so if I ever go and cover something that is a neglected crisis, that is a humanitarian crisis, if I link that, I mean, half of these things are linked, right? Climate change and humanitarian crisis with, agriculture, farming, climate change, everything, health, it's all linked. And if you can bundle those together, it gives you a much better shot at pitching these things to editors who might not otherwise be interested, which is, a shame. But that is sometimes just the way that it is at the moment, but it is changing. I think it's awful, and that also gets very little. That comes into the same sort of conversation. So I don't think it's necessarily because it's Africa. I think um, it comes under the banner of places that people do think about less in Western media, and that is a problem because people shouldn't. I mean, it is relevant for a Western audience to know these things. And I think what it does suffer from, at least in the places where I've covered a lot, is their protracted crisis. These are things that have happened, again, and then some of them have happened again, even if they're completely different. An editor and an audience that might not know as much about the continent, when they see a headline, a war in Sudan or famine in Somalia, they go, yeah, I mean, we've seen that before, even though it's completely different, even though it's completely new, even if the last one that they heard about 6 years ago or 10 years ago, or in this case, at the moment in Darfur, 20 years ago, people's, people build a reputation in their head of a country, of a certain place, and that really sticks. And you can see that a lot. I've done a lot of traveling in Sierra Leone and around West Africa and Liberia. Absolutely beautiful, very peaceful, really incredible people, incredible culture. People should be traveling there all the time as tourists and everything else. Moki was talking about this earlier, and it's held on to this reputation from wars and from other violence that it did have 30 years ago, 40 years ago. That is such a long time ago. And that hasn't really changed. And I think that that's the same with the news cycles, is these protracted crises and people seeing them, same as DRC. And then on top of that, they are very hard things to cover. So, I mean, for me anyway, if I wanted to go cover Ukraine, which I was just there a few weeks ago, the whole cost of the trip for there for like 2 weeks was about a quarter of the amount of something as I spent for 10 days to cover Sudan, for example, right? So the access, I think, in Africa is tricky. At least it's much harder for me, because people, if I'm a local journalist, is definitely easier, but that doesn't, sometimes it makes it less safe, because then if you're South Sudanese and you're writing sensitive things about South Sudan, that puts you in danger sometimes. I think that's very tricky. I think, yeah, cost is really hard at the moment. I mean, the sustainability of being a journalist, like Moki said, is you can do a few good stories, but how do you keep that going? How do you keep you've got to spend money to make money, and that's really, really tricky as a freelancer with very little support. I mean, Abdi was talking about it, today when he was covering the protests. He has very little, safety equipment, and the reassurance that maybe a company that, he was talking about staff photographers, they have a support network that's going to help him, but freelancers really just don't have that. And that all contributes all together to these places being neglected because they're just harder to cover. I think without also the support of the governments allowing journalists to come in, right? If you make it really hard and really expensive to get accreditation, it's how any journalist, local, foreign, anyone is going to get in there. I think I said to you in a meeting last week when I was in Ukraine, my press pass was the 34,000th press pass that they'd given to journalists over the last 2.5 years. I mean, that is a mind-boggling number of journalists to cover one war, but that's kept that at the top of the international, headlines for 2.5 years, and that's actually what it takes because of people's, the way that the industry is. And if in Sudan they're letting in, 7 journalists in the last year and a half during the war, that sort of summarizes the amount of coverage that can just come out of that place.